No, it's really wonderful to have Akil back to Brown. He's so wonderfully stimulating always. I must say that I think we all are very sorry that Bashara Dumani can't be here with us today, but we're going to have Akil Bigrami, who is the Sidney Morgan Lesser Professor of Philosophy at Columbia and faculty member of the Committee on Global Thought, and his, obviously the author of many, many books, most recent, the Secularism, Identity, and Enchantment from Harvard University Press in 2014. That's the most recent? Yeah. Okay, thank you. And his concept is academic freedom.
Thanks, Elizabeth. You know, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. I had a lunch date at 1:15, for which I was late, and that's why I left. I do have questions for Brian and for Lisa, and really, in a sense, I would rather ask those questions and explore their answers than present my own paper, but I'll hope those questions come up again in discussion sometime. So this paper is on a very topical theme, and in a way, Adi, in one of his questions, linked it with Trump, so I don't feel too bad about departing from the Trump theme. It's really about current controversies on American campuses, and so these reflections have been prompted by them, and it was really written because I heard somebody whom I respect a lot and is a friend of mine speak in an extremely intense and slightly out of control anger on questions of diversity and freedom. And the conflict between diversity and freedom. This is David Bromwich, a friend of mine. And I was quite sure that he was wrong, but I didn't quite know how to think about what I felt was wrong about it for a while. And I remember we were both speaking at a conference, and when I noticed this about his paper on the first day, I was supposed to speak on the second day, I actually abandoned the thing that I was going to read and wrote this paper in a much rougher form. Anyway, here it is. So what is this dispute today that prompts my reflections? Let me just expound them. You're all familiar with it, but let me just set the stage. Recent efforts to put constraints of accountability on freedom in the academy mostly arise out of the salutary commitment which universities have adopted in the last few decades to the value of diversity and difference. The problem, as we face it in its most current form, seems to be this. The commitment to diversity and difference has generated a wide variety of demands, mostly from students, such as the curbing with sanctions of the incivility of aggressive hate-mongering speech, and even the many microaggressions, as they are called, that lie just below the surface of seemingly civil speech and cause offense to particular groups, such as the creation of safe spaces for minority and even women students facing an insensitive and complacent majoritarian and male ethos, such as the requirement of trigger warnings in the classroom when teaching texts containing material that might offend particular groups, descriptions of rape or of brutal treatment of African Americans in the South, for instance, and so on. Those are the demands on one side. On the other side, there is the claim that all these demands are either direct threats to the freedom of speech, or they create an ethos of inhibition of free and open inquiry, discouraging the full expression of the voices and personalities of free inquirers, to pursue controversial paths of inquiry, which have in the past frequently been the paths that yielded new and fruitful forms of knowledge. And since the pursuit and transmission of knowledge is the chief mission of institutions of higher learning, such inhibitions are particularly unwelcome in such institutions. So that's the dispute, completely familiar. Let me begin by putting aside one sort of person on each side of this dispute who I think does not deserve to be taken seriously. On the side of free speech, I'm not going to consider the sort of person who I actually find contemptible, the person who is brazenly inconsistent in his or her championing of free speech. I myself know a few such people who, for instance, express high indignation about the threats of free speech that come from what they describe as political correctness that pervades campuses, deriving from ideas of diversity and the acknowledgement of historically oppressed minorities, but then are quite prepared to ignore the value of free speech when it comes to the expression of criticism of Israeli government policies towards the Palestinians and the American government's support for such policies. It is obvious that these are people who do not care to protect free speech, they only care to protect the speech that they politically favor. As I said, contemptible. On the side of diversity, I'm not going to consider the sort of person who simply subscribes to the politics of identity and difference as a reflex, just following a trend that is widely in the air, pursuing diversity more out of a sense of not wanting to go against the current political trend than out of a genuinely committed conviction for the sensitivities of disadvantaged groups in our midst. The pejorative term.
Excuse me, but we can't hear that well on this side.
What am I doing wrong?
Even closer.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
You need to kiss the microphone.
Sorry?
You need to kiss the microphone.
Kiss the microphone, okay. The pejorative term political correctness is a good description of such people, and as a term it should be restricted to describing them in particular, not the general politics that recognizes the importance of diversity, which when it is genuine rather than merely a reflex, is a humane and worthy form of politics. I should admit that I particularly mention such a person and dismiss him or her because I fear I might, as a callow youth, have in some small portion been such a person, with just such a tendency to unreflectively follow trends, not regarding issues of diversity, but on issues that motivated the more traditional left in the late 1960s. Putting aside then these contemptible or shallow ways of subscribing to the positions on one or other side of the conflict between freedom and diversity, what shall we say of the conflict itself? Here first are some elementary sociological observations, also familiar to you. As I've already hinted above, the first and obvious thing to notice here is that it is the younger generations on campus, the students who are on the side of diversity, and are prepared to forego free speech when speech expresses hate and causes offense. Though there are no doubt many faculty and administrators who are on that side of the dispute, and many students on the side of free speech, I think the older and younger generations, by and large, do distribute differently, with the former more clearly and insistently and in larger numbers on the side of free speech, trumping the demands coming from the politics of identity and diversity. After Joan's talk, I must sticks in my throat to say trumping. The historical reasons for this are not hard to find. For all the commitment of some faculty to identitarian ideals in the 1980s and 1990s, the older generations on campus today grew up in the shadow or in the legacy of McCarthyism, and even after McCarthyism subsided, they experienced the inhibitions on certain kinds of left-wing speech and expression during the long Cold War. It is a reaction to this experience that shapes much of their, I should say our, since I'm part of that generation, deep commitment to free speech. But for the younger generation, the students on our campuses today, all this is lost in the mists of what seems like ancient history. It is certainly not what centrally shapes their experience as it did for us, and so for them there's no such historical ground on which free speech seems to stand with the same compelling centrality. What they grew up on is a quite different kind of politics, a politics of identity, battling the complacence of standard liberal universalist ideas, which dismissed identities as parochializing sites of mobilization, and even battling traditional left politics, which recognized no forms of disrespect that did not owe to class differences, often explicitly downplaying the disrespect that owed to differences of race and gender, and in my own country, the difference of caste in particular. It is these battles which have reared them in their sensitivities that they want respected, even if it means putting aside the protections of freedom of speech. There's a further element of their experience that fortifies this. They were born in a social setting where social encounters are by no means restricted to face-to-face or voice-to-voice telephonic conversations. The internet, in which they participate with far greater relish and ease than the older generations, has undoubtedly increased the freedom with which speech can be aired. But at the same time, the internet, precisely because it is the site of conversations and eavesdroppings on conversations that are not only not face-to-face, but are frequently with anonymous interlocutors, can generate a form of abusive discourse on sensitive matters without any identification of the abusive agent behind it. As a result, not only is the younger generation too remote from the history of McCarthyism and the Cold War to see what is so ultimately compelling about free speech for the older generation, they actually associate free speech with the boundless possibilities of abuse and offense that its exercise can make possible on the new electronic social sites that dominate their social orbit. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that they can quite easily place free speech second when it clashes with what they feel much more strongly about, their genuine sense of the importance of the dignities long under threat by social biases on race, gender, ethnicity, and so on. So much for the sociology of such disputation. How shall we then think of its effect, which is my subject, its effect on the nature of knowledge and inquiry, especially in the humanities, where these demands and sensitivities are most present? I'd like to recklessly make a bold proposal, which needs much qualification that I won't be able to pursue in detail here, 30 minutes, so I must apologize for the broad stroke with which I have to make it. I'd like to suggest that what many of the students are seeking in their desire to put constraints on liberty or autonomy from this perspective of greater accountability is a model of inquiry in the humanities that is closer to the ideal of what happens in inquiry in the law, especially criminal law. This is not how they or anyone else has put it, as far as I know, but it does seem to me to be implied by the sorts of demands they have made. Let me explain what I mean by inquiry in the law, especially criminal law. Take the instruction given to jurors that a defendant must be presumed to be innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. On the face of it, this seems the wrong instruction to give someone who's in charge of making an inquiry. The usual instruction in inquiry is, keep an open mind. If in inquiry one makes a presumption on one side, then the presumption might cause one to be skeptical of the evidence that is presented by the other side. Why then does the juror not get the instruction to keep an open mind instead of the instruction of presumption of innocence? Why? The answer ultimately lies with some sense that there are prevailing and submerged prejudices that need to be countered. On the practical side, there's the obvious prejudice that ordinary people who form the jury, tend to be swayed by those in power and authority. Just think of the Milgram experiments. And it is more usual to find prosecutors relying on those in power and authority than the defendants, though cases of police brutality are an exception, but by and large. So that's on the practical side, a prejudice to be countered. Just the weight of authority that comes from the state which the prosecutors are on the side of. On the cognitive side, there is the prejudice of thinking that if a charge has been brought against someone, there must be something to it. A prejudice often expressed by the cliché, where there's smoke, there's fire. So, to combat these prejudices, an instruction of presumption of innocence puts certain normative constraints on inquiry. And this entire constraining model for inquiry carries over in detail to how evidence may be gathered, indeed what constitutes admissible evidence and what does not, what may be said by the witness and what is struck from what is said, and so on. What does this model of inquiry in the law contrast with? Most obviously, it contrasts with the long-standing ideal of scientific inquiry, and if Kuhn is right, of course, more honored in the breach than in the observance, but that's, in scientific inquiry at least, where there are no such constraints as you find in criminal law. You gather whatever you can gather in coming to and testing scientific hypotheses in whatever way you feasibly can. In saying this, I'm of course not denying what is known to everyone, that for instance in the last few decades, constraints have come from animal rights concerns about inquiry in laboratories, nor am I denying that there are many experiments that simply cannot be performed on human beings for obvious reasons. And to repeat, there are also the subtler constraints that Thomas Kuhn described as the unspoken prejudices of orthodoxy, or of what he called normal science. But despite all this, what is traditionally considered exemplary in the natural sciences is inquiry that is to be as unfettered as possible, that is to proceed without any ex ante and built-in constraints. But criminal law practice, as it has evolved, would not be criminal law practice if the constraints I mentioned were not ex ante, built into what we conceive inquiry and investigation to be. And students today are increasingly claiming, I think, that inquiry in the humanities is like inquiry, modeled in this way on criminal law, rather than as in science. In methodological debates among scholars in the humanities, the ideal of scientific inquiry has been questioned, at least since Weber and then Dilthey, and then through the entire Verstehen tradition. But the familiar issues there had to do with the fact that there's a more interpretative perspective at work in the humanities, rather than the explanatory hypothesis construction as in the sciences. That is not exactly what the students' demands are seeking today. Nor are they pointing to the other familiar element of humanistic study that is said to contrast with science, that its objects of study, unlike the objects of natural scientific study, are much more pervasively laden with value. The idea is not, or not merely, to say that the subject matter of the humanities is value-laden, but rather that the responses that we have to that value-laden subject matter may turn on sensitivities that have been sharpened by a greater awareness of the importance of diversity than hitherto existed in our societies, with their widespread prejudices against what is anomalous, not to mention majoritarian prejudice, or at least majoritarian complacence in our societies at large. Thus, just as with criminal law, it is the correction of pre-existing prejudice owing to one or other social or historical factors that a sort of analog to due process is demanded in inquiry and pedagogy. So the model of inquiry that I'm suggesting is being sought by the young today in the last few years is not just a replacement of the scientific model with a more interpretative and value-laden model, as in the hermeneutical traditions, but the quite different model of criminal law, with its form of constraints of accountability on the processes and the articulations of the outcomes of investigation, what can and can't be said by witnesses, what must be struck, and so on, just due processes. Now, my suggestion about a new descriptive model for inquiry that is emerging from current demands to respect the politics of diversity on campuses, this model based on criminal law, turns crucially on the idea that the latter's instruction, criminal law's instruction to the juror, that innocence be presumed, is rather than keep an open mind, that innocence be presumed, is motivated by a desire to correct for natural pre-existing prejudices that surface in the context of how crime is legally adjudicated. The politics of diversity, making its normative demands for constraints on the articulations of inquiry and pedagogy in universities to correct long-standing background of prejudices as well. So I'm saying that's the... but someone might argue that the model does not apply because I've misstated in the first place the motivation and the justification for instructing the jurors to presume innocence rather than keeping an open mind. Now, I must confess to having just made up the justification all on my own. I didn't find it in the scholarship and literature on criminal law, which to my surprise in my searches in it has very little to say. I mean, this is shocking to me, actually. It has very little to say explicitly about why there's this presumption of innocence. Scholarly literature is really slack on this. Bizarre. I have no explanation for it. I just presumed that what I'm saying was for reasons, because it's just obvious and commonsensical. And when I constructed these reasons and motivations, I indeed thought I was stating the obvious common sense on the subject, something anybody would think of if they thought just a little hard about why such a presumption was put in place. But there's one article in the literature that is specifically on the subject. I found one interesting article which is specifically on the subject, and it gives a quite different ground for the presumption of innocence than I have done. Alexander Woloth, in an article called N Guilty Men, N, the variable N, in the University of Pennsylvania Review 1997, argues that it is the presumption of innocence is based on a normative premise that it is better that N guilty go free than one innocent be punished, where N can have a wide range of values, substitutions. So that's a very different motivation from the one I gave about countering prejudices. Woloth also argues in that article that the presumption of innocence, very interestingly, that the presumption of innocence instruction is really simply synonymous with is synonymous with. It's just another way of putting a different instruction that is given to the juror, which is that prosecution must be found to have established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So Woloth claims that the motivation for the presumed innocence, he claims two things. The motivation for the presumed innocence instruction to jurors is that it's better to have any number of people who are guilty go unpunished, but than to have one innocent person punished. And the second claim is that the presumption, the instruction, presumed innocence, is synonymous with you must find a high threshold of evidence to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. All this amounts to a quite different understanding of the criminal law model than the one I had presented, from countering prejudices, etc. And if it were correct, the criminal law model would be quite unsuited to describe the model of inquiry that I think is being proposed by students on the via the politics of diversity on campuses. But I think Wallet and others who might follow him on this are simply wrong. First of all, it's not quite right to say that presumed innocence is synonymous with guilt must be established beyond a reasonable doubt. They're not synonymous. This is because, it seems to me, jurors can decide that someone is not guilty if that relatively high threshold, defining reasonable, of evidence is not met, and still think that the person is not innocent. That is to say, they may well think that technically he or she is guilty, a technicality forced on them by the instruction about guilt requiring a certain threshold of evidence. Right? So they may technically think that the person is not guilty, but they may nevertheless not think he or she is innocent. Something, of course, they cannot do anything about because they've got this instruction about the threshold of evidence. So we might say that the logic of criminality assessment is not bivalent. It is not, as in the Latin expression, tertium non datur. That is to say, no third possibility. So the logic is not just guilty, innocent, it is guilty, not guilty, a technical decision, and innocent. Three different things. Right? Now, if I'm right about this, this is sort of crucial. If I'm right about this, and the two instructions are not synonymous in the way Waller thinks, then I would argue that this exactly explains why Waller insists that the only motivation for the instruction of presumed innocence is the one he offers, which is, no innocent person must be found guilty. The motivation he offers, that it is far better to let many who are guilty go free than to have one innocent person punished, is a good motivation for instructing the juror to seek a high threshold of evidence for establishing guilt. But it is irrelevant to the other instruction of presumption of innocence, which, since it's not synonymous with the threshold of evidence instruction, must have another motivation, such as the one I had offered, of countering prejudices that accompany the standard context of criminal trials. And the students on campuses, I'm saying today, are making demands on inquiry having certain constraints with precisely those motivations of countering prejudices. Now, all this, I think, are relatively new developments in the methodological horizons of scholarly knowledge and inquiry. Is it a healthy development? Well, I want to get through the next half an hour without telling you my views on this, whether it's healthy or not. I mean, I have very strong views on this, but I don't want them to be detectable in what I'm only kidding. But I will say this, assuming, for the sake of argument, that what I've said is right, let me then just close by adding one nuance to the proposal that might help to deflate some of the anxieties it prima facie gives rise to. If we take seriously, and I think we would be utterly foolish not to take it seriously, because I think this is really the issue which is going to be explored. I'm sort of shocked that people haven't put it this way, but if you do put it this way, it's, I think, a good way to think about what needs to be explored and answered. Even if we do model inquiry in the humanities in the way that I believe is coming out of the demands of the younger generation on our campuses, I would think that the first thing to notice is that even in criminal law, there is more than one way to understand the sorts of constraints that it places on an inquiry and its outcomes and their expressions. In the last several decades, ever since the outreach of the law, and criminal law in particular, into the realm of transitional justice, the possibilities of a quite new model of inquiry emerged even within the criminal law. This new model sometimes even puts aside the very ideal of forensic justice, because the aspiration in transitional justice, take South Africa as the absolutely central case, the aspiration is that one has to live in the future side by side with the people one was judging. Moreover, much of the crime was not merely active or explicit on the part of a few, but complicit on the part of large numbers of the population. Forensic investigation was therefore besides the point. It actually undermined this idea of engaging with the people one had to live with, even as one judged them. How did it undermine that? How did forensic justice undermine the aspirations of transitional justice? Because forensic justice is a detached or disengaged form of inquiry, whereas the need was to engage with the accused and the adversary, not simply see them in objective terms of evidence. All of this has deep relevance to the academy, and even if we were to take criminal law as a model for how to understand humanistic inquiry, even if we were to accept the increasing accusatory and adversarial ethos on campuses, the thought cries out that it is a model of criminal law that emphasizes engagement, as in transitional justice, rather than the detachment of forensics, which happens in, say, the court downtown, right? That better fits the inquiry model in the humanities. But if that is so, then it's not clear that the constraints of accountability that are being sought today can be seen, even by those who seek them, as posing any deep threat to the liberty that has traditionally been cherished in inquiry. The reason for this is quite straightforward. One can only engage in the transitional justice sense of engage, even with one's adversary, if one is prepared to hear their claims, and for that one has to give them the freedom and autonomy to speak the deliverances of their inquiry so that we might hear it and engage with it. That notion of engagement is what the transitional cases of justice introduced into the criminal law. The refusal to treat the subjects of judgments as objects, by seeing them in purely disengaged or detached terms, silence targets of forensic investigation sitting in the dark. If the model of criminal law that is emerging for humanistic inquiry understands itself along these lines, modeled on the transitional rather than the forensic exemplar, a whole sea of controversy that is expressed anxiously as freedom versus accountability can, to a considerable extent, subside. There's right on each side. That is to say, even if there's right in the demands that push us towards modeling humanistic inquiry on the law, criminal law, rather than as in science or in the Western tradition, a proper understanding of criminal law itself, as it's relevant to the humanities, would allow for liberty, though now liberty would be legitimated not by cliches regarding the marketplace of ideas, something from John Stuart Mill down to Oliver Wendell Holmes, but on grounds that link the law itself to a less detached and more engaged understanding of itself and its processes of inquiry. Thanks very much.
Discussions of academic freedom specifically?
Sorry?
Could you make the link between the model which I found really compelling, your as a response to David Bromwich, whose piece I also found very disturbing.
Yeah.
But could you make the link to the ways in which the debates about academic freedom are taking place now? It's not just free speech, but it's academic freedom. Often the two are confused, but your concept is academic freedom. So I guess I want some more explicit connection.
So my thought, Joan, is that if freedom of inquiry in the academy is modeled on criminal law, and the grounds for modeling it thus are that we are in a context, just as with criminal law, of countering pre-existing prejudices, long-standing prejudices. And so there must be constraints on what can and can't be said, just as in due process. What can be counted as evidence, what can be said by the witness, and so on. So similar things are being said, I don't want this said in the classroom, these, et cetera, right? So there are constraints on what can and can't be said. And I'm claiming it's like criminal law because the motivations for saying it in criminal law, putting those due process constraints, are countering existing prejudice. And that's exactly what it is here, right? So it's of a piece with that. So I'm saying it's not like scientific inquiry, right, which Thomas Kuhn apart is supposed to be unfettered, etc. You just do. It's basically keep an open mind, right? Just always keep an open mind, etc. It's not that. And it's not like in the Western tradition. That's an interesting critique of the scientific inquiry model, but it's irrelevant to what, this is different. This is more like criminal law than the hermeneutical and traditional, and the Western tradition's critique of science. So we have now three models, I'm saying. There's the scientific model, there's the Western model, and now there's this new thing. I believe this is a brilliant new phenomenon that's emerging implicitly in the students' demands. It's a really interesting notion of inquiry that's emerging from the demands about the nature of the humanities, etc. And I'm saying, if I'm right in making this connection and modeling it on criminal law, I'm saying criminal law itself has two models. Right? Within it, there are two models. There's the forensic one that happens in the courts downtown, right, where you just sit silently in the dock and you just get investigated. It's objective, disengaged inquiry. But in the transitional cases, as Tutu and Mandela and all said, look, we've got to live with these guys, right? So we can't just forensically investigate them. We must engage with them. We must ask them to confess. We must, it must emerge out of engagement with them rather than just study them detachedly, right? They are subjects. So it's a first-person point of view on them, first and second person rather than a third person. See them as the third person to be in. Now, if that's right, then there's engagement, I'm saying, of that kind would still require hearing everything before you respond to it. And I'm saying freedom now, if you're still going to want it, will not be modeled on John Stuart Mill and all that stuff about the marketplace of ideas. It'll come from a quite different justification, which is criminal law. I accept the constraints, etc., but criminal law not in the forensic exemplar, but in the transitional justice case exemplar.
But just to, how do you distinguish that from the listen to my pain, here is why you're hurting me? You know, the old diversity workshop models in which you bring in mediators to, and the black kid says to the white kid, when you say that, it hurts my feelings, which is supposed to then shame or bring to a kind of contrition the person participating in what is in fact institutional racism of one kind. How do you make that distinction in terms of the kind of inquiry that's being? I mean, I'm really taken by what you're saying, but what I wonder is how to make this a model of inquiry rather than the kind of authority of experience that makes my claims superior to yours.
Well, there's a sense in which that superior to yours idea is even there in transitional cases of criminal law.
That's why I was asking.
Because if you think, in a funny way, the confession, which was so much stressed by the transitional cases, right, and which is almost nothing in the forensic example, right? But the confessional model really goes back to old regime France, right? Because confession was the highest form of evidence prior to the penalities of the Enlightenment. I mean, Foucault writes about this a little bit. And that's, but in old regime France, in pre-Enlightenment penality, confession was the highest range of evidence, I think because of a general Cartesian ideal that we know ourselves best, right? And that's the kind of thing that, the authority that you're talking about. And though it is absolutely true that in the transitional case of justice, it isn't we know ourselves best so much as I want to engage with you, therefore I want you to speak. So it's a different reason for putting confessions central, right? It's not the Cartesian motive. It's not just driven by Cartesianism, but it's driven by the engagement. I think this is, in a way, your question is making me think that authority of that kind, of the confessional mode in the old sense, and this engagement thing probably have more to do with each other than I've presented. But that's a very good thing to bring together. I'll think more about that. Thanks. Please give him a microphone.
I also found it very sort of interesting and compelling, this notion that presumption, in order to counter prejudice, could be operative in both cases. But I see at least two problems with what you're presenting as a sort of analogy. And one is that if you're taking an analogy from law, you're talking about a case, but a case which pertains to a particular individual or a particular body, a human body that's being accused. Whereas
Speaking to the mic more.
You're speaking about a case that, as comparing it to an inquiry that is associated with a particular accused person, a human body. Whereas in the case of scientific inquiry, you're talking about, knowledge? And in the case of the humanities, you're talking about a discourse that may or may not be associated with particular individuals who are promoting that discourse. So that's one sort of problem with the analogy.
Oh,
yeah. And then the other one is the valence of the prejudice, because the valence of the presumption that in law we tend to think of it as good. We presume more justice, we presume more innocence. But in the case where you presume that the discourse or the inquiry is prejudicial, you're assuming and you're presuming something that is bad or
presuming.
Yes, you're assuming that there is negative prejudice. Prejudice that will overall have a negative effect on, that the discourse you're examining is prejudicial. Whereas in the case of someone who's maybe alleged to have committed a crime, and they haven't, the presumption is intended to, make things better if they haven't.
Well, let me go to the first one. I'm afraid I'm going to ask you to repeat the second question and actually not to repeat the words, but to put it differently, because I'm not sure I quite have it. But the first question, the analogy isn't meant to be in every respect. The analogy is, in science, there's no accused. You're absolutely right. There is no accused or anything like that. But the point, the only point is that certain normative constraints on how to inquire, what can be said about deliverances of inquiry in a classroom or in a research paper or whatever, has to be sensitive and answerable to existing prejudices, right? And in some sense must be shaped by, and I'm saying that's exactly what happens in criminal law. Otherwise you would give the instruction, keep an open mind. So the motivation I'm claiming, okay, now I don't know, everybody, Voloth doesn't agree, but the motivation really is that you do this because in a courtroom there are prejudices. Where there's smoke, there's fire. If somebody's been accused, there must be something to it. Right? This is just a cognitive prejudice that is completely widespread. I mean, I have it when I'm, all of us have it in some sense. Where there's smoke, there's fire. We have to fight against it in some way, right? So helping you fight against it gives you a different, one instruction is, it's not just an open mind. You actually have to presume an innocence, etc. And I'm claiming that's a very different justification from, it would be disastrous if an innocent person gets punished, etc. Now, I'm claiming that keeping an open mind, I'm claiming that the motivation of not, the worst possible thing could be an innocent person being punished, is a very good motivation to give the instruction, must be a very high threshold of evidence, right? But a very high threshold of evidence is just not synonymous with presumed innocence. I'm saying these are two different, and if Waller's motivation is apt for the high threshold of evidence requirement, I'm saying countering prejudices can be retained as the motivation for this. Now, that's the only thing I'm saying is the real analogy. There's no accuse, there's no, so the analogy is not meant to be perfect in the detail. It's meant to say, what would inquiry be like and what would its deliverances, the expression of its deliverances in pedagogy and research, etc., must be constrained in these ways. And so really, it's not like science anymore, which it never was, but it's not really got to do with the interpretative and so on, of the hermeneutical tradition either. It's a genuinely new model of inquiry, right? And now, that's the only sense in which it's intended, the analogy. It's not meant to have every detail of criminal law present in these other things. But I think this is sufficient to raise a question, and if you just left it there, I'm saying, it would be clearly something that makes people anxious about free speech, because you are, these constraints might actually prevent certain things being said, etc. But I'm saying it may be the case that we ought to see, if we even see this model of inquiry along non-forensic lines, then we loosen it up in just the right way to get rid of these anxieties. Now, listen, one thing is right about if you're, somebody might say, quite rightly, that I've looked up the answer book first, right? I want free speech. That's a value of mine. So I'm going to no doubt insist that the right criminal law model should be the transitional case where engagement is present, right? But I don't believe I'm doing that. I honestly wasn't interested in doing that. Why? Because I really do think that what transitional justice cases brought us to be alert to is that we can see the law quite generally, even in the downtown courts, in a less dehumanized way. I'm not just targeting the free speech issue. I really do think the transitional justice cases showed how the standard criminal law is a highly dehumanized process. And it teaches us a lesson of much greater generality, nothing to do with just free speech, is that we should not, and this is a point made by Foucault again and again, that we should not reduce the human being to the citizen. The category of the human being is a much wider category than the category of a citizen, shaped by constitutions, laws, codes, and so on, right? And that's really what the transitional justice cases, I think, brought to the fore. And it really does have the effect of making this analogy go through. And so I'm not saying this just to preserve free speech. I'm actually saying this because I think there is a lot of dehumanization in the law. The transitional cases have made us alert to it quite generally, and it's a fallout of it and its notion of engagement that this happens. I'm really sorry that I think I'm just, in my advancing age, not able to hear what your second question was.
Do you mind, John, if we wait for that second question? Okay, because I have quite a list. Susan?
Yes, I also find it extremely interesting and really quite enlightening. So, you know, this question comes from that space. But it seems to me that there's, again, I'm going to stick not to citizens. Citizens of me was the answer to the last question, but to the historical specificity of the situation. Because transitional justice was after victory.
What?
After victory.
After victory.
Okay, this is not at the time when the struggle was going on. So the question is, and I think it's a good one and a relevant one to your mode of analysis, I would insist on putting it into historical, not context contextualization, but what is in fact being, what is the power implication of what we're talking about. And there, the question is, have these groups who feel unjustly prejudiced against, or whatever the word is, that they are uncomfortable by this kind of free speech, if they actually felt that they had won, I think the transitional justice model is absolutely correct. But during the struggle, and right now it's a struggle, whether we talk about Me Too or Black Lives Matter, whatever, it's a struggle. It's a different situation. So how do you negotiate that?
Thank you. Yes, I think you're right to say that there are different places where the disanalogy, you pointed to how targets are not there in all cases, but you're certainly right that this is another, I mean, the best I can, I mean, the more insouciant response would be to say, I'm not really concerned to find it analogous even in that sense. But I don't want to say that insouciant thing. You see, I think, first of all, I think it's not so obvious that the victory was anything but tentative in the case of South Africa. It is, you know, I mean, I just think there's an enormous amount of retention of all the things that are present. And I do think that a kind of tentative, extremely piecemeal victory has happened on campuses. You know, you just cannot behave in the way you did 30 years ago. Faculty can't behave in that way. People, you know, feminism has brought some gains. There's just no doubt about it. And it's highly tentative, I agree. It's complete, it's very easily reversible, and it may be ephemeral, all that. But there's a sense in which it's now the availability of the discourse of diversity as a real normative discourse, which was really hardly available a few decades ago. And the question is, what does one do with it now? What demands might one make now? And in that sense, I think there is a level of analogy, right? Because it's not obvious that it was a complete victory in South Africa, especially looking at how things have turned out. It's just astonishing how continuous it is with the past. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so partly this picks up on John's question, so maybe we can have another go at that. I guess I will grant your depiction of like kids today as you began. Okay, and I have two questions about that. One is picking up, I think, with what John was saying about the law. I would say, given your characterization, is there not often in the classroom, in fact, a sense that there is an accused, meaning we're going to find this text, this old text, guilty of such and such. So you said to John, you know, I really intend only the due process correction of prejudice aspect of the law. But I think, you know, would you grant that there is an additional sense of textual inquiry, often as a trial, about the innocence or injury of such a text? So at Columbia, for instance, I know that Ovid's Metamorphosis was found guilty of harm and taken off the core syllabus. So that's one question. And then,
What's the harm?
he's,
Pass him the mic.
Oh,
okay, sure, yeah.
We can't hear.
And the second question sort of follows from that, which is the degree to which what is at stake in the situations that are being adjudicated are matters of inquiry at all. So whether that's again, granting your characterization of students today, whether inquiry is, I mean, we know, you know, a trial is a great way to present, I mean, a trial is an inquiry, we know, but a trial is really a great way to present information and also find out things. So even in a novel, in a film, it's a great storytelling device. You can really lay out a great deal of information. But my sense of the debate that you're intervening in is that inquiry is sort of far from the list of terms on the table. And if that makes sense, you can take it up. If not, maybe it will make sense to someone else.
So you want to say that inquiry is the wrong word to use to describe what we pursue in the humanities at all? That's fine.
No, the debates that you're entering into seem to me to have inquiry sort of very far away. Of course, the humanities I take to be in the normative model of the past have inquiry as their basis, but that seems to me separate from your characterization of the situation. And perhaps you could just go over it again, but it seems like a...
I'm just using the word inquiry at a high level of generality, you know, I mean, in the way that David Hume called his, it was not science, he called it a treatise of human inquiry, and you might have literary inquiry, and I'm...
For instance, do you mean what is going on in, just to be specific, do you mean something that is going on in the classroom? Is that the kind of thing that you're
the classroom, you know, many things happen in the classroom. Some people just present what they've researched or inquired. Some people inquire with the students and so on. I mean, these are all ways of talking about how we present arguments, evidence, reasons, and so on for conclusions. I want to use it at such a high level of generality that it applies to science, it applies to the humanities, it applies to the social sciences, it applies to the law, criminal law, and so on.
I would like to push on this question, but this was not my question. And I ask you, just to give a concrete example. And
We can't hear, we can't hear.
I'm asking Akhil to give a concrete example. I'm entering a classroom. I'm going to teach Orientalism. And I would like...
You're going to what?
Orientalism. Orientalism.
Oriental.
You know the book, right?
Why is it so?
When you
Can you speak into the
When
microphone?
you walk over, you turn away from the microphone. You have to keep
Okay.
the microphone in front of you.
Hold it in front of your mouth.
Hold the microphone in front of you.
So if I adopt the model that you discussed, what am I supposed to do or not do? So please give us an example. But now I would like to turn to my original questions. I agree.
But Adib, all my thoughts desert me if I'm asked more than one question. So let me just answer that, and you ask me the next one. So one example might be there's some absolutely cruel, sadistic thrashing of um, so-called natives in India by a brutal English army. And somebody says, well, I'm sorry, I want to be warned that you're going to do this, and it's not obvious to me that I have to, it's right for me to sit through a reading like this. It upsets me greatly. Just constraints of what can and can't be said.
So where's the prejudice here?
Sorry?
Where's the prejudice here?
No. There are long-standing historical prejudices that the book Orientalism talks about, right? Treatment, the West's understanding of, and given all those prejudices, etc., right? I'm filled with sensitivities on these things. I don't even want to hear now. This is a very highly developed sensitivity. I don't even want to hear about this. It just upsets me to hear about it, right? To have these things, and you can quite truly say that many texts, right, actually get a titillating sense out of describing cruel torture and so on. They glamorize the violence even as they claim to hate it, just like Eliot's, hypocrite lector, or what is it, Laforgue, or so. Who was it? Was it Laforgue? Who was Eliot quoting? Mallarmé. Baudelaire. Hypocrite lector, right? Somebody who says, I really, he describes the stuff as something he's against. He's having a terrific time as he, wallowing in it. So all these these are highly developed, subtle sensitivities that have emerged as a result of feeling the weight of historical prejudice, right? So these are all very similar to the kinds of things that I'm saying happen when they're given pre-existing prejudices. You put constraints of one or other kind. That's just one example. There might be any number of such examples.
What would your response be? Did you finish the story?
How do you teach
Finish
it?
your story. So then you would.
How do you teach it?
Right. Then you will.
No, I'm just saying the question he asked was, give me an example of what kind of constraints are being demanded to counter, and what are the prejudices? Well,
What does the teacher do?
he didn't ask me for what's the right thing to do. He just said, what is...
We're asking.
The scenario.
The scenario proposed is the scenario of the courtroom, right? The institution of justice, which insists on a presumption of innocence. But in the case of the classroom, as I understand it, it's a new institution that's established by the kids who say that instruct a presumption of guilt, and that was what I was trying to get across with the notion of valence. So I think that the amazing thing about what you're presenting is that it is compelling and interesting as something that structures what we're encountering and is happening, but that the analogy has misdirections or is disordered to the extent that it introduces misdirections that are really problematic.
Can I?
Okay, I hope its problematicness ends up being fruitful when you try and respond to it. But there are disanalogies, and if the disanalogies make it problematic, it'd be nice to hear about it.
Order in the courtroom.
Thank you. Okay. I think the problem is that we're speaking at such a level of generality that there just is no application, even as people might want to say to you, Akhil, nice, okay, let's not constantly adjudicate right and wrong, let's actually think the long game. Great, okay. But there's too many generalities, because if we're talking about freedom of speech and the way in which it's been debated at Columbia, freedom of speech has been extended to the right-wing speakers who the administration or other bodies, the on-campus Republicans invite, but not to the students who protest, those speakers. And in fact, those students were being, potentially, were going to be, pay large penalties to the university, were going to be penalized, suspended, etc. So what do we mean by freedom of speech? What's at stake in that argument on campus? How would that be adjudicated by a transitional justice model? I'm not sure that that's the way to go here, but we might want to see the way in which the campus is no more disinterested than the state is when it comes to actually figuring out where we can have freedom of speech and where we cannot. So freedom of speech is not universal at all, and it isn't universal on campuses. Second, the classroom, you know, to talk about there have been so many gains on campus, the classroom is still segregated. In fact, it's going to be increasingly segregated in the coming years. The people who might want the kind of forensic adjudication that you're talking about, they're not even in the classroom, certainly not at Columbia, most of them. And the ones who are in the classroom are basically running up massive debt that their professors did not run up, debt that their congressmen did not run up for that education. So I don't think we can afford to speak in those generalities. Finally, the students aren't asking for diversity. Diversity is the language of the university in order to respond to what is a much larger, more radical call to reinvent the university in terms of the people who are missing, not just fiddle with the structure in terms of the people who are present. So that's, I feel like, let's get the stakes on the table rather than just try to decide whether we want to go forensic or transitional here. And I do think the analogy is not quite working, even as I can understand why we want to go there. You want to say, let's come up with something that allows, you know, us to still live together. But the us who should live together are not the campus. You know, it's not the campus population. I think that the other way to go is to talk about pedagogy, which is what I think Joan was asking us to do. And I do worry that the model you're proposing puts us back into the realm of experience, you know, the telling of experience, anecdotal evidence, and so on. So maybe we should be thinking about reinventing the university. Let's get rid of disciplines. Let's think of other categories that we should be using to think with, to reimagine knowledge, like water, something like that. And maybe then, and of course, how to make education free, then maybe we would produce different kinds of knowledge in different ways.
Jack, I mean, I think Columbia's administration stinks in the way it implements many things, and you've given an example of how completely inconsistent it is in some of these things about invitations and disinvitations in particular. All that is completely correct. See, not all bad things are the same bad thing. I'm not trying to say that there aren't all those bad things going on. I'm not addressing those bad things. And I am unblushingly speaking at a high level of generality. Yes, I am speaking at a high level of generalities because I'm not trying to address all issues having to do with academic freedom.
But that's what generality does. It pretends to address all issues when it can't address any, potentially.
Well, I'm trying to... all explanations in any subject have to abstract from things to a level of generality to set up an explanandum to be explained.
So maybe we give up on explanation.
You give up on an explanation of everything. You explain...
Maybe that's not the pedagogy we need. That would be what Rancière might say. The explication, exegesis, maybe there's the issue. One of them.
If there's a fire in the dark where wood catches fire, and there's a fire in somebody's drawing room where a cushion catches fire, right? There is a real sense in which these are very different events and need different explanations. But there's one sense in which there's something in common, combustion. So sometimes you abstract from the details of both, you set up something to be explained, and you do it. That happens in everything. Now, I don't deny that I've abstracted away from all issues. I've just said that there is a striking thing that this kind of inquiry is just something new. It's different from the other kinds of inquiry, the debates that we've had about science versus hermeneutics and so on. It's a different kind of thing. I think it's a fascinating, illuminating. It's surprising to me that it's come so late explicitly in the history of the academy. And I'm struck by it, and all I wanted to do was to find a model for it which might shed light on it. And I'm not saying that that things I say will, just by what I say, will show that what the Columbia administration has done in an asymmetric way is going to be exposed to be unjust or unfair. Other things will expose that to be unjust and unfair. So really, I mean, the charge of generality is something that I accept without qualm.
I need to move to Lynn, and then also, I don't know if you noticed, but I cut off the boss. His real question never got posed, so, you know, we'll see. I'm sitting next to the boss. So, Lynn?
Yeah, so my question, I think, sort of goes to what Joan had said about, you know, the language and sort of her.
Lynn, you need the microphone.
Sorry. I was saying my question sort of goes to what Joan had said about the language of hurt, and a little bit maybe to Jack what you were saying, but I think that I'm maybe more pessimistic about what language students are also using. But what I would say, if I followed your argument right, it seemed like you were saying in this sort of mode of inquiry now, it's not the mode of inquiry of scientific inquiry, keep your mind open. So therefore it's the mode of a kind of juridical inquiry, but you're suggesting a different kind of justice, but a kind of legal inquiry. But I think I would say, isn't it a different kind of inquiry than either of those inquiries? And, you know, as someone you'll hear tomorrow who studies television, I would say what differentiates it, for example, from the mode of inquiry of the talk show, which is to me what really a lot of this discourse is very much in like talk show inquiry mode, whereas you're saying that you're speaking the truth of your experience, right? In some ways sort of borrowed, historically, I think the talk show borrowed from things like consciousness raising, but with the addition of commodification and consumerism, so you're speaking your own experience in ever more precisely defined demographic terms, so that you have to ever narrow the identity that speaks that experience, and then the mode of inquiry is basically about what will the satisfaction be that you can buy that will provide you with comfort, right? So to me it seems like, and I, again, sadly feel like students have bought that language of diversity, which I see as totally a consumer commodity discourse. So I think that leads me to a much more pessimistic place, that if the mode of inquiry that they're using is not even in terms of justice, but in terms really of like consumer satisfaction, right, then I am not quite sure how that can, I would love what you're saying to be, you know, that there can be a way we could re-articulate it to open things up, but I'm not sure. So I'm just wondering what you think about that mode of, that mode of inquiry, if that made sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess I had restricted myself quite narrowly to the academy. I'll think about it, Lynn, about how it might extend.
Because, I mean, to be just most simplistic, I feel like, you know, again, a model of pedagogy that is in fact like the Oprahfication of the academy, right? So I feel like the model of inquiry we follow is, not that I don't love Oprah, I do, but I feel like it's the Oprah model, so.
No, I agree that extending this to public education generally at all sorts of non-standard sites, but non-standard is invidious, but you know, the academy doesn't set any standard, but in all sorts of sites is really something I haven't thought about, and it's a good thing to think about.
But even staying within the academy, just to add on to her thing, it's the right as well as the left that's making those claims. It's not only that our free speech is being limited, it's that we are the oppressed victims of their intolerance.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah, Lila first and then Françoise, and then the boss has yielded.
Mike.
I will not do everything if you call me the boss.
Just a quick question, Akhil. I was curious why you settled on the model of inquiry rather than judgment. Since not justice, I mean, in a sense, the two oppositions here in our conversation are inquiry and justice. But judgment is...
I was assuming that judgment would be an outcome of inquiry, whether it's forensic or whether it's through greater engagements and so on. So judgment is certainly the goal, and if one interprets, I mean, if one takes judgment in the loose enough sense, then there's judgment, whether of truth or whether of just interestingness or whatever, in different, academic inquiries, and judgment of guilt and innocence in the criminal case. So sure, I think judgment was very much in the offing in what I had in mind, but I'm just assuming judgment is an outcome of inquiry.
Just a quick footnote. It's just that in the academic context, there's a way in which inquiry follows judgment. That there is a curriculum and there are syllabi in advance, there are canons, and then it is that there's a way in which inquiry is sort of post facto rather than something.
Well, I mean, that would be a subtle version, I think, of having a prejudice and then inquiry either confirming or infirming it. I mean, that's what, a philosopher like John Rawls calls reflective equilibrium. You start off with intuitive judgments, you then do philosophy, and then you either consolidate the initial intuition or you revise it and so on. So I think a lot of it is holistic in that sense. Probably that would be something to generally bring into how to describe the methods of inquiry.
Okay. Just some remarks. It seems to me, and this go back also to what Jack was saying, that the inquiry, in fact, it's not about an inquiry because it cannot start yet, because things has not been done for the inquiry to start. I mean, the kids, the famous kids, are not asking for a new inquiry. They are asking for a different different body of whatever text and so on, from which a new inquiry could be developed. And I'm thinking also, because I know that there is a United States, but there are other parts of the world. So I'm thinking about South Africa and all the movement in the university there for the decolonization of the institution, not just of knowledge. And even when we speak about the student or the younger generation or the kids, I mean, we are speaking for them. We could perhaps ask ourselves, what form of inquiry as teacher, what could we think of in light of what we know today? Of everything that has been transformed, or what we see, or the Trump situation. So not as if there are kids, there are some whatever uniform mass there, and so we have to answer to them. But as teacher, as in charge of teaching, what do we think? What kind of also, if we still keep the term of inquiry, what kind of inquiry do we want to develop in our classroom?